Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about a little experiment that I did for myself, but I thought it might also be useful to you guys, and that is testing out an alternative solution to the battery life problems of the a6400. I bought the a6400 quite a while ago to use it to assist me in making YouTube videos, and one of its biggest cons versus the a6600, for instance, didn't bother me too much, and that was the battery life. In theory, I understood that I would have to carry a bunch of these little guys around and swap them quite frequently, and the idea of that didn't really bother me. I never really had a problem carrying a bunch of extra batteries anywhere I go. After all, they don't weigh very much, they're not very big, and they have a very nice arrangeable shape. And sure, the battery life isn't great, but it also isn't terrible. So yes, you might have to switch a battery out every hour or so, but that's just a few seconds in an hour. It really didn't seem that terrible. But then I actually started making some videos, and I would use the a6400 as a behind-the-scenes camera for YouTube videos, or a behind-the-scenes camera for a music video I did with my band, or an actual B cam in some cases. And I realized that this battery life is actually becoming an issue for me, and it's not for the reasons that you may think of when you're just thinking simply that you would have to switch the battery out once every hour. So first of all, let's take the scenario of filming a photo shoot behind the scenes with the a6400. So I take the camera, put it in the corner somewhere on a tripod, set it up in terms of the lighting and the colors, and I just leave it on. If I'm not already recording, I would at the very least leave it on, ready to start recording. I'd have my remote in my pocket. Whenever I feel like we're starting some sort of scene, I just hit the record button. Now, of course, the camera is on and the battery's dying the whole time, even when I'm not filming. And herein lies the biggest issue, is that if by the time I'm ready to record, if it's in the low ranges, in the 15, 20, 30% range, I won't be able to depend on it to capture the scene that's about to happen, because I don't know how long that scene is even going to be. And in any case, I want I want a safety buffer of battery life. So I just go out and swap the battery. So it becomes a case of swapping it out way more often than you'd think. And in a scenario like this, where you're trying to keep so many things in mind, you're doing so many things, you're trying to film this scene, you're setting up the tripod for that camera, you're trying to get an angle for that camera, you're trying to set up your lighting for your actual photo shoot, you're trying to work with your model, you're trying to work out your settings, you're trying to work out the angles in the scene. And now swapping the battery becomes something that you have to think about quite regularly as well. The more things you have to think about, it's kind of an exponential effect rather than an additive one in terms of making your life a lot more difficult. I also thought about plugging the camera in through USB to make it run a bit longer, but that didn't work too well, and it's also an additional thing for you to think about, because now plugging it in is an extra setup step, and you may have to get an extension cord, you have to position your camera somewhere within reach of a socket otherwise, you have to, bring a bunch of cables out, you have to plug it in. If you want to move it, well, you have to think about it again, etc. So I started looking for a solution that would work for me, and to work for me, the solution needs to work both when the camera is, stationary on a tripod, and also when it's being handheld by someone filming behind the scenes or anything else. And the solution that I decided to go with was one of these Sony battery mount thingies that attaches to a camera cage and a dummy battery that hooks into that. And along with that, I also bought a camera cage, of course, to attach this stuff to. And to be honest, I kind of prefer using a camera cage when weight isn't an issue anyway. So yeah, now that the long intro is out of the way, I just basically wanted to share in this video with you the experience of using this setup and its pros and cons, because it has some cons that at least I didn't think of initially. As well as that, I also wanted to share with you how the battery life compares between different setups of using the standard Sony battery, or using the Sony battery but with the camera plugged in through USB, and of course using two different sizes of the Sony batteries mounted through this adapter here. So the first and pretty obvious point is that the a6400 is a pretty compact camera. It feels quite good with the right lens to have with you. It's quite easy to take with you anywhere to use it. It's quite light and very, very portable, I would say. You can add on a little bracket like this so that you could offset the mic position and it doesn't block your screen, and it's just very light and works great. The weight of the camera with the battery in it is only just over 400 grams, and that's really light. And if you add a whole 4 extra batteries, that only comes up to just over 600 grams. However, the rig with the cage and the mount and everything attached, and the smallest Sony battery, weighs 740 grams, and that makes the camera quite a bit more bulky and more difficult to pack unless you want to take things apart, and I don't think anyone's going to want to. Not to mention, it actually weighs quite a bit more than the bare camera with 5 whole batteries. Now, if you swap that small Sony battery for a bigger one, we're really entering some heavy weights over here, with the whole thing weighing over 900 grams. And this is probably the setup that would give you an equivalent total runtime to the other 5 batteries, but we'll find that out later. Now, the bulk and weight of the camera in this setup didn't really bother me much again, because this wasn't a setup that I was going to use in a weight sensitive scenario like hiking up a mountain or something like that. In that case, I would still be taking my little Sony batteries with me. What is an issue though with this setup, and one that I haven't anticipated, is to do with the cable for the dummy battery. Now, that cable is quite long, and that's probably a good thing depending on your setup. But in a setup like mine, as you can see, what I do is I have to figure out a way to wrap that cable around my lens so that it is both not too slack, but also so that it can reach the port on the mount. Now, this is an issue for me personally because I don't want my cable being loose where it could, get caught on something or be in the way of something. So fair enough, I have to arrange the cable in some way, and it's not the prettiest thing around, but it gets the job done. But the actual issue arises when you want to do 2 things that happen quite frequently, at least for me. The first of these is swapping the lens. If you want to swap your lens, good luck getting the previous lens off and the new one on, and not ruining your little cable setup and having to redo it. The second issue is when you want to get your memory card out, since you have to open the battery door. And this happens pretty much every time you want to grab footage that you shot and get it on your computer. You have to get your memory card out, pop it into your card reader. Now, if you've managed your cable in such a way that it isn't loose anywhere, there's no way you're going to be able to get that battery door open enough to get your card out without having to undo the whole thing and then redo the whole thing later. So yeah, these issues aren't major, but it's nice to be aware of them because I definitely didn't think of these things when I was considering the setup. But saying that, I don't think I would have gone for something else anyway, even if I had considered those issues. The setup allows me to set up my 6400 for a behind-the-scenes shoot and just pretty much forget about it, unless I have to swap lenses, which is basically the trade-off. But anyway, now that my mini subdued rant is out of the way, let's get into the actual comparison between these setups in terms of battery life. So I just wrapped up all the testing, and I must say I am surprised on a few points here. But before I go into those, let me share just a few points on the specifics of the test that I did. So the way I carried out the test was I basically set up the camera in a very similar way to how I normally use it. I shot in wide focus mode, autofocus, and I also pointed it at a moving tree, so at a subject that actually, the camera has to actually keep tracking it. I also shot HLG3 in 4K 30, which is how I normally shoot. And I shot with the LCD screen set to just the standard brightness with 0, not sunny weather, not plus or minus 2, just at 0. So for the standard battery test, I shot on 2 different brands of batteries. They're both third-party batteries. I unfortunately lost my original Sony battery, but yeah, I wanted to have at least 2 different brands to remove any kind of inconsistencies because they are, after all, third-party manufacturers. And I'm really glad I did that because this new set of batteries that I have from Neewear, it performed much better than I expected, I would say. The battery is rated at a pretty standard 1100 milliamp hours, which is the same as the other battery brand. And it gave me a pretty nice runtime of 1 hour and 30 minutes, which is, to be honest, quite a bit more than I expected. And even after hitting 0% on the battery, when the battery just gets crossed out, it actually ran for another 19 minutes, which is really nice. Although, a little disclaimer here, if you're in a scenario where you're able to swap batteries, you're never gonna really let the camera run past 0 unless you don't care about what you're recording, which is pretty much never. So by that point, you'd have swapped your battery quite a while ago. So this kind of running past 0, I think, is only a nice thing when you're in a kind of more of an emergency situation where you're trying to squeeze every minute out of your battery. And I'd much rather have those 19 minutes in the main span of the battery life so that I can more accurately estimate when I actually need to swap the battery. Nonetheless, that was a pretty good result. And then I swapped to the other camera brand, which is RAV Power. It's, the same rating, 1100 milliamp hours, but for some reason this battery gave me a really poor result. It only ran for 35 minutes and it gave me just under 3 minutes after it hit that 0 mark. And that was really bad. And to be honest, that was more consistent with my experience overall. I always felt like these batteries die pretty fast. If I had to make a guess based on my experience without looking at any numbers, how long these batteries last, I would never have said that they last over an hour. But I think that there was just something wrong with that particular battery. And I did try another RAV Power battery, which is exactly the same, rated to 1100 milliamp hours. I bought it in the same place from the same seller. And it actually gave me a much better runtime of 1 hour and 17 minutes, much closer to the Neewear. and it also ran for 19 minutes after hitting the 0 mark. Anyway, for my next test, I decided to plug the camera into USB power, and I had the Neewer battery in it this time, and this was where I was really surprised. My prior experience running off of USB power, I think, may have been with perhaps a worse battery, because the battery still died, just not as fast. In this case, the camera actually recorded continuously for over 6.5 hours before I had to just stop it because I had to go to bed. And at that point, the camera had only reached, you know, the last bar of its life, meaning there was at least probably 25% of the battery remaining. The next test was performed with one of the external battery setups, and I used one of the smaller Sony batteries. Well, actually, I think it's the smallest size you can get, which is the NP-F550. This particular one is again by RAV Power, and it is rated to 2900 milliamp hours. So based on the power rating of this battery, I would expect the battery to last somewhere just under 3 times what the internal batteries last, and yeah, it was in the ballpark. It went for just over 3 hours, 3 hours and 3 minutes before it died. The next test I did was on the much bigger NP-F970 battery, and it was rated to 7900 milliamp hours. This specific one is by the brand DSTE. Now for this scenario, I was prepared that I would not be able to let it run its full course in just one sitting. So what I did was I just let it run for as long as I could in one sitting. Then I took the battery off, and then I came back, put it back on, and continued recording. And the total runtime was absolutely stunning. It ran for 12 hours and 38 minutes total. And that's kind of what I would expect from a 7900 milliamp hour battery if I was to, you know, judge that based on the Neewer 1100 milliamp hour battery. So I think that in this case, I mean, I've obviously only tested 3 of these RAV Power batteries, but those 3 have been slightly poorer performers, unfortunately, in this case. Including one of them, which was, you know, extremely poor. Oh, and one interesting thing that I experienced with this external battery setup is that the camera doesn't actually do a very good job of reading the battery percentage. So what happens is that at first the battery appears to be dying quite quickly, and you just lose percent numbers as if it was an internal battery, but then it really slows down. And the point where it really slows down is, you know, like under 10%, about 8 or 7%. That's when it gets really slow at draining in terms of the percent numbers at least displayed by your camera. So I have some numbers here just to let you know for interest. So this bigger battery, right, the 7900 milliamp hour one, by 50% it had run for 2 hours and 34 minutes. Then by 20% it had run for 4 hours and 29 minutes. Then by 16% it had run for 6 hours, and so another 2.5 hours from 20 to 16%, and 4% it ran another 2 hours. Then in the next 8%, from 16 to 8%, it ran for another almost another 2.5 hours actually. So it had already been running for 9 hours 20 by 8%. Then by 7%, it actually ran for another hour in 1%. And yeah, the remaining, I didn't really take more readings there, but from 7 to 0, it actually ran for another 2 hours and 15 minutes or so. So yeah, just a bit more info that it's good to be aware of. But anyway, that is all the test results I have for you. I hope that you found that useful. My main takeaway from this is the fact that this external battery setup is actually really useful, especially with the bigger batteries. Like I thought, you can just set it and forget it. But also very usefully, it showed me that not all of these small NP-FW50 batteries are made the same, and that you can get some decent runtimes on some of them. I've got a super exciting upcoming trip to the Lake District where I'm going to be wild camping and doing a portrait session on a mountain. Hopefully, we'll see how it goes. And you know, I obviously plan to take my 6400 with me to do the filming for that. And I will be quite comfortable relying on the little Sony batteries, let me tell you, after this test. Oh, and you can find all the details for the hardware I used in the description. Let me know if you found this video helpful by giving it a like, and consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.